Hi, I'm Stan Stalnaker with Hub Culture and Hub ID, and we are here at the Bermuda Tech Summit talking about digital identity. It's one of the most fascinating areas of the internet today because it's one of the most important areas. It's something in a way that we all rely on, but it's not something that everybody thinks about. Digital identity is actually probably the most important foundation of Web 3.0. What does it mean? Why is it important? How do we manage it? These are the questions we're going to be talking about today within a really incredible panel. Lucy Yang, Justin Newton, Alex White, Bruce Silcoff, all leaders in the digital identity and decentralized space. Welcome to the Bermuda Tech Summit. Let's start with some introductions. Go ahead, Lucy.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, BDA, for having me here today. So my name is Lucy Yan. I'm based in Toronto, Canada. I'm the community director of the COVID Credentials Initiative. We're part of the Linux Foundation Public Health, a project particularly focusing on helping public health authorities and their stakeholders to fight pandemic and also as well as other public health issues through open source and technology and open standards. So the community, I'm a part of the COVID Credentials Initiative. We started off last year when the pandemic, when COVID unfortunately became a pandemic. And since then we have been working towards facilitating a global standard, how we can work together, leveraging the digital identity technologies already have in place and being developed to fight against this pandemic. So that's how I'm going to contribute to today's conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lucy. That work on COVID and identity and credentialing is so important. I'll be so excited to learn more about POIP and some of the other work that you guys are doing with Linux and Linux. Let's move to Justin for an introduction next.
Thanks, Stan, and thanks as well to the BDA for having me here today. It's really exciting to be here. And Lucy, what you're working on is super exciting as well. I mean, none of us are happy for COVID to be here, but it actually is a particularly compelling use case for decentralized identity. So it's great to see you jumping on top of that and really taking control of that situation. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Netki. Netki, we do identity, but particularly identity as it relates to risk and compliance. We've been working in the space, both the crypto space and the identity space, since about 2014. And we have a couple different products in the area. One is a KYC and AML customer onboarding tool. So scan your documents, take a selfie, check against a bunch of lists in the background. But we've done some things to make it particularly powerful for people that are working either inside of cryptocurrency or in other adjacent spaces around high-risk payments, like cross-border payments or other things like that. The second thing we did is we've developed what's the industry's first compliance communications protocol, which is basically an off-chain protocol that allows the counterparties in transactions to be able to exchange privately and confidentially identity and other related metadata around an on-chain or cryptocurrency transaction that the counterparties might need for risk and regulatory purposes, but that you want to keep private and hidden from anybody else in the world. That's really what we've been working on. Frankly, it's been really exciting stuff.
That's amazing. Another person working on these decentralized technologies in identity is Bruce Silkoff from Shyft, a Bermuda company. Bruce, tell us about what you're up to.
Thank you, Stan. And since I saw the Emmy Awards last night, I'm going to make my speech appropriate. I'd like to thank Stan, the BDA, my fellow nominees, my agent, and the Academy for having me here today. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've been in business for 30 plus years, so probably one of the oldest guys or people in the blockchain space. But I come from big data world, having run loyalty reward programs for about 27 years. I've also been an incubator of some game-changing and leading edge technologies that help us do things a lot better. I got into blockchain and crypto probably about 5 years ago. I am now the CEO of a company called Perseid Limited. It's Bermuda-based, proud of it. We are at the forefront of digital identity frameworks, helping jurisdictions put their countries onto digital identity platforms and enabling interoperable data exchange that leverages the Shyft network protocol that we had as a vision 4 years ago, and we're proud to say launched the mainnet in March of this year. And excited about what we're doing and what can be done all out of Bermuda. So thank you for having me here.
Great. Thank you very much. You know, we are talking about Bermuda and the Bermuda Tech Summit. So what an appropriate moment to introduce Mr. Alex White, who's the Privacy Commissioner of Bermuda, and very much looking at all of these issues from a national perspective. Alex, welcome.
Thanks so much, Stan. I'm really excited to be here as well. I am the first Privacy Commissioner for Bermuda, so I'm responsible for setting up the office and establishing how the Personal Information Protection Act will apply in Bermuda. And if you're familiar with GDPR in Europe or PIPEDA, however you'd like to say it, in Canada, you'll know it's a very similar legislation to those laws. So I come from the US originally. I'm a lawyer qualified in the US, former US federal privacy advisor, and I served on the advisory board for the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals, having worked in state government and the insurance industry before this. And for the purposes of our conversation today on digital ID, our office has become a member of the ID 2020 Alliance, and I sit on the Risk and Compliance Advisory Board for that organization. So thanks so much for having us. Delighted to join you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to begin with just a brief overview, maybe from Alex, setting a bit of a framework around privacy in the context of digital identity. Privacy remains one of the most important components of really digital identity, in the sense that it's one of the things that people think about the most when they think about why digital identity is important. And it's also something that really sets the pathway and the framework for how companies are developing solutions for digital identity. So Alex, I keep the spotlight on you for just a brief second. I'd like to ask you that first question, like, what are the potential privacy issues around digital identity generally? And then we'll kind of leap off that with the rest of the group.
Okay, terrific. Well, we tend to think about digital ID as consisting of facts and figures. So it's the name and birth date and those sorts of statistics. But it can go a lot further than that, as this group knows. It can capture a lot of other elements like education, hobbies, your beliefs, occupation, social activities. There are a variety of different uses. The same way pretty much any type of personal information can be used for a variety of different uses. So one of the risks when it comes to digital ID is that we're bundling all of these details together. And so you have the potential that there could be oversharing, or where you only mean to access one particular piece of information, but in fact you access others. So instead of doing an age check, you've accidentally accessed someone's health history, or if you're trying to look at one thing, you come across some other detail that's related to a protected status or minority status that could potentially lead to mistreatment for an individual. So there are concerns about what kind of generalizations could be made about someone's life, or how we might group people and have second-class citizens, the risk of that being formed by the way digital ID is used. And of course, there are not strictly privacy-related details like access to technology or access to information, access to the internet that could also come into play and affect different groups in different ways. And that's actually an interesting example of where Bermuda is a relatively good jurisdiction to trial tools like these, because it has such a high internet and mobile device penetration rate. But back to your point about privacy risks, so there are risks, but there are also opportunities. That's the flip side.
Absolutely. Bruce, your company is working on developing consumer-side solutions to address these opportunities and these risks. How does your company address the things that Alex just introduced?
Well, based on what Alex just said, we look at identity as not just who you are, it's also the things you do and the places you go. And there's a lot of value that's currently attached to that information. The problem is today, we don't have control of our own data. The ones that do have control of it aren't doing a very good job of storing it, of sharing it, disseminating it. And we need to do a better job. We need a solution that keeps up with society the way they are today. And unfortunately, there's something that's called blockchain that we've been able to harness the power of and develop a protocol that provides for more efficient and secure interoperable sharing of data. It also gives back control of that data to the individual who actually owns it by having a permission or consent layer as a core fundamental part of the solution. So that's the way we're tackling it today.
Okay, so there are two ways by which a company or a group can obtain identity data about a person. One way is that a person can go on to, say, a site and put that data in. And the other way is that a company can access public information or other types of identity data to build a profile and then provide some level of say, identity verification service. So I'm just kind of curious now, for Justin, your company, Netki, are you guys doing both of those types of things to build identity clearances for customers? And can you talk a little bit about how Netki is building its digital identity services for companies?
For sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in our case, our focus around doing identity validation actually really sits in two areas. The first is around document validation. So looking at the various, issued identity documents and other things from countries or governments or other sort of authorities out there. And the second is around biometrics. You spoke a bit about sort of the knowledge-based stuff today, where it's based on, either public or private information that's available about the user. To be honest, those kinds of tools they can be directionally helpful, but they're never sufficient, particularly in financial services use cases, because what we've seen is, frankly, the bad guys have access to all those same data sources that we do to do the validation. And so it's actually funny, but one of the ways you sometimes spot the bad guys is they got every single one of those questions correct, because most of us forget what street we lived on 20 years ago, or what my third cousin's middle name is, or some of those other questions where those folks that are accessing the same data sources can get it. And so, one, I actually find knowledge-based authentication and the data tropes behind it to be incredibly dangerous to personal privacy, because they're taking a lot of information about us as individuals and putting it out there where people can license it, where people can get at it without licenses, et cetera, to build profiles about us, to impersonate us, and to do other things. And then the second piece is that it turns out to be giant leaks of data that doesn't end up turning out to increase the reliability of identity validations because of the fact that the bad guys are ahead of us. And so, really you need to focus on sort of primary sources around things, and just knowing something about a person isn't nearly enough to say that it's actually the person. As maybe a simple example of that is, if I was a rogue or renegade employer, I know the name, birth date, and social security number of every single one of my employees. And I know their home address and maybe a couple other things about them. And so for many of the knowledge-based authentication you see out there, I'd actually know all of those details about the person without being them.
That's so interesting. And it even goes deeper when you start getting into biometrics, because if you have a data leak of biometric information, theoretically, that information becomes another layer in this. And so I'm really curious, hopefully we can get into it a little bit later, about what the solutions might be that could emerge that would solve for that. And it seems to me that it's almost some sort of real-time, non-permanent identity verification that's happening essentially instantly when you try to do something. But that is probably not the world that we live in yet. I think before we go there, I'd like to come back to Lucy for a second. You know, the work that you guys are doing around COVID verification is extremely timely because there are many places in the world that now require some form of verification around your health status to be able to travel. And particularly, what's interesting about that is that the idea, and somebody said this earlier, of what identity is beginning to change, because typically we wouldn't have thought that our health status was going to be an integral daily part of the things that we do. But now in New York, to go to a bar or restaurant, you need to show a vaccine verification. There are other places. Can you give us an idea in Canada and other places, how you're seeing this emerge? And we're going to fit this health component into this bigger identity situation.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think this is a really great start point of the conversation, because we see a lot of confusion around like the definition of identity, right? I think if we talk about in academic terms, we can have a narrow kind of definition of identity, which is pretty much the whatever identity documents, like information you have, that's identity, right? And like you said, now that we're expanding that to like way more broader, and also to Bruce's point earlier, it's not only about who you are, but also what you do. It's pretty much in a broader sense, identity is whatever kind of data that can help someone else identify who you are, right? And that's and the reason why there's a lot of discussion around even the use of the word passport is because does individual look at your proof of vaccination as identity or not? And also even thinking about verifications of proof of vaccination, we don't just take that proof as an identity document, right? You always have to have either your like passport or something else with your driver's license, to actually verify you are you. Right? It doesn't matter of what kind of personal identifiable information on that proof of vaccination you need to provide, whether it's digital or whether it's on paper, for someone to know is actually you own that piece of proof, right? And I think that, and also you mentioned that very important point. I think what COVID is kind of making turning sharing sharing of health data is more kind of forcing us to share that health data at an unprecedented level, in the sense like how often you have to share it, right, and who you have to share it with, and also cross border wise, right? How many countries you have to share it with, right? We have make a lot of comparisons between COVID and certificate and yellow card, right? But if you think about how often do you actually have to use a yellow card and where do you have to use yellow card, is pretty much not comparable. I think if we're bringing kind of this conversation back to actually the privacy aspect of COVID related data or health data, is I think we look at it at multiple layers. One layer is because you now share it more frequently, right? How you want to make sure that each time you're sharing it, you're not being tracked, right? Whoever gives you that information in the first place, that doesn't know where, even like whoever wants to know about it doesn't know where you are. I think that's one very important aspect of privacy. And another aspect is, when you're actually sharing that piece of information, to what extent, it's reasonable, right, for you to share it, to make sure that we're managing the health risk and properly, at the same time we're protecting individual, like either your identity or your personal data. I think that's where like the identity and the privacy kind of at least for the COVID case, right, are kind of are overlapping.
So Lucy, I'd like to come back a little later to you and dive deeper into what post-COVID identity management might look like. And maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the things that are emerging, whether it's ID 2020, which Bermuda has just joined, or Common Pass with the World Economic Forum, or even these new like layered standards called TOIP. But I'm curious for Alex, how is Bermuda responding to this? Bermuda has one of the best programs in the world around COVID, not only for visitors, but for citizens. We ourselves have worked on technologies to help with quarantine. There's a lot happening around testing, and it has generally kept, you could argue that Bermuda has done relatively a lot better than many other places in the world. But how is this affecting the evolution of the view of privacy within the country?
Well, it's a very interesting point because I think a lot of places have seen that privacy has become much more real to people because of the COVID crisis. There, a lot of the potential privacy dangers that people would talk about were very abstract. Someone observing your behavior online or something like that. But when it comes to disclosure of your health identity or your health circumstances and receiving differing treatment based on those health circumstances, suddenly that brings it into pretty sharp focus. So I found that with every crisis, there's an opportunity. And so this has been a good teaching opportunity to show the value of privacy, not only in helping us to accomplish our goals. I think that's a very important message, is that this is not an either or conversation where we either protect privacy or we fight COVID. No, we need to find a way to do those things together. And so privacy can help build the trust in the different public health mechanisms that we need to utilize. And what I found, and again, my office is an independent office, so I am separate from government, overseeing data practices for private and public sector. But what I found that when I work with my colleagues in the various government functions, they come to me and they want to make sure that they're building these tools the right way. And so that's been very exciting to see an already privacy-friendly proposal be the first draft. And you don't get that everywhere. And so that's been very exciting from my perspective.
Okay, great. And taking it over to Justin, you guys are managing millions of identities for people all around the world. How are you managing this privacy aspect? And I think after this, and a word from Bruce, we'll move on from privacy to some other areas, because digital identity is such a big issue, and privacy, I feel like, is front and center, but there's actually much more to dive into here. But Justin, tell us, how are you guys protecting privacy for your customers in your technology stack?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's relatively straightforward. We only ever used identity data and information, with the direct and specific user's consent about the specific activity that we're utilizing it for. And so, for example, you're never going to read in our privacy policies that we're going to share PII with marketing partners, or use it as a way to optimize images that we're going to show you as a part of the service, or anything like that. In our case, we utilize your identity data for KYC and AML customer validation. And then, other than that specific use case, we own no rights to that data, and we don't use that data for anything else. There are some specific use cases, specifically with the travel rule tool in Transact ID, where identity information can be shared at the time of a transaction. But again, this is done at the user's specific instruction and consent. It's not like we're out there sharing willy-nilly with random partners. It's that the client themselves wants to make a payment and knows that identity needs to go with it, and is making a conscious decision to move forward with that step. And so for us, frankly, the best way to protect the user is to bring them into the loop and allow them to make a decision about the way that their identity is being used, and to not use it without their full knowledge and full consent.
Okay, sounds like a fair deal. Bruce, same question to you.
How about you repeat it, please?
How are you guys at Perseid and Shyft protecting the privacy of the users, and how are you managing this data related to the way that Alex was talking about the needs for privacy within the larger frameworks of a governmental context?
Okay, so as I mentioned before, one of the core aspects of our digital identity framework is having a permission or consent framework whereby we give full control of a person's own data to that individual. That is fundamental change, a paradigm shift in the way data is managed. So that is at the heart of our solution. I want to touch on something Alex just said, though. For you to have a global identity solution with interoperable data exchange, it has to be built the right way. Governments want their self-sovereignty, individuals want control with consent layers, and industry wants efficiencies. That's why it's important to sit at the table, to collaborate with all the stakeholders and come up with some kind of general consensus or DID framework standards that addresses the needs and wants globally. For us to go about it as individuals will set us back in terms of timing. And it is a race because of the challenges we're facing with criminal activity or those that are abusing our data. In 2020, the FATF, or the Financial Action Task Force, issued a 105-page guidance that anybody in the identity space must read. It sets out guidance and recommendations on how digital identity frameworks need to be built. It talks about multi-factor authentication. It talks about consent and permission as being fundamental to the solution. So, I mean, it's tough to go into a 105-page document right now and give you more than that, but this is how we do things the right way in digital identity, and core to their recommendations is building a consent or permission framework. And that's exactly what we have done. We have built our solution, the Bermuda-based solution, in line with every single one of the recommendations put out by the FATF.
That's really fascinating. And that was a very, very important piece of information that came out from FATF. Bruce, you did mention a little thing, and I'm gonna pull it out for Lucy, because you mentioned something called DID. And DID and X509, for people who are not too familiar, are the kind of base standards by which some of this identity framework data is being built on. And these are coming from a project called the Trust Over IP Foundation, which is connected to Linux. Lucy, could you talk to us a little bit about these standards and how the goals for these standards are evolving within the community of TOIP?
Yeah, I think there are actually multiple standards are involved, and just at least from the COVID kind of perspective, or just in general, like in digital identity space. Trust over IP is certainly a very, very important community. But the standards you just mentioned is goes way beyond just like one community. So we're more, what Bruce just mentioned is like collaboration is very important. So we see multiple communities, and I can name a few, like W3C. They have a credential community group, which is doing a lot of like the standard on verifiable credentials, and also like you just mentioned, decentralized identifiers, but it did. And also the 509 is more kind of established standard coming from like it already been established and used for a long time. So that's the reason why like you look at the EU, and like that's what they're adopting, right? I think we're kind of in because of COVID, and also some of the great work that's already been done like by government and also private sectors prior to COVID, we're seeing kind of like like shift from like how like centralized managing like personal data identities to like more kind of decentralized managing data identity. I think one kind of like particular kind of consideration for COVID is if you're looking at the actual passport we're using, right? And there's very clear established kind of like rules of who can issue passport, right, and who can verify passport. But in the case of COVID, right, and vaccination certificate is more kind of clear. Like in most of the time, in most of the scenarios, like the government are like kind of governing like the vaccine data and also issuing the vaccine certificates. But when it comes to test results, right, it's way more complicated and also way more fragmented. So it's really, really hard for us to define, who are like, this is the list of, issuers of COVID, different kind of COVID certificates. And, these are the verifiers, especially now we're talking about restaurants and events and stuff, right? And that's why there's a need of, moving from, the existing kind of centralized like standards. There's a set of standards, go beyond just X509 to like, the more of a decentralized, as one of the things you mentioned, decentralized DID, right? As well as, verified credentials, as well as many others. Some of them are kind of existing standards evolving into, right? There's kind of in the transition, adding new capabilities and new ways of doing things on top of existing standards. So that's what we're seeing that's happening, among so many different communities within Linux Foundation. There's also many other like initiatives, like I can name a few, like even like IEEE, right, are doing something there. And also there's mobile driver's lessons, like standard right now are also thinking about how they can be more kind of incorporating like new standards like verified credentials. And also there's Cantera initiative, which focus both on, identity, data, and also privacy, right? There's so many of these, technical communities like are working together, which is very, very important because like Blue says, right, it's one company, right? We're a few companies, a few communities only, doing it in their own silo. We won't be able to have something like, a framework that we can use globally.
Okay, great, got it. Makes sense. I want to take a quick swim in the seas of tokenization. Bermuda is known for its beautiful beaches and its beautiful nature, but it's also a great place for some of the most advanced and leading technology in decentralization. One of the things that people in decentralization are talking a lot about is tokenization. Bruce, I know that your company is active in this area and you guys have developed a token. Can you talk about how tokenization fits in with your company?
So a token in our situation is a utility, and similar to Ethereum, it's the gas that runs the protocol. For you to be able to transact on the Shyft network, you need to be able to use a token for data exchange. So users, holders, buyers of data will use the token to transact within the protocol. That being said, our protocol is not token specific. We are network agnostic and have bridging that enables us to work off of any network, and that provides universal appeal. We also are an open source solution so that you can build any solution on top of the Shyft Foundation protocol.
And what does it mean to build something on top of the Shyft Foundation protocol? Does that mean that a listener or a company that's in the ecosystem could use your technology to be able to create a product, or how does it work in terms of that building component?
So any solution that you could imagine that involves the exchange, the interoperable exchange of data can be built on our data. I'm going to call it a data superhighway to put it into layman's terms. So imagine us building this highway where you can exchange data, and solution providers can build on top of it to leverage that information. So take it that you're in the music industry and you want to manage data rights. You can do that across the network. If you want to do peer-to-peer lending, if you want to do a vaccine passport and you want to be able to securely and efficiently share vaccination results, PCR testing results, you can use our network to do that with multi-factor authentication, with cryptography, with attestations that are stored in a secure manner, using public keys, but whereas your data is still, your individual data is still held privately.
Okay, that makes sense. For Alex, do you see a vision for privacy and identity emerging out of Bermuda that can be exported around the world? I know that with the premier, he has spoken about the idea of Bermuda becoming a foundation for global digital data services that can be available to citizens anywhere, and that Bermuda could be a kind of safe harbor for these types of futuristic activities. How do you see Bermuda's work on the privacy front, but also across things like tokenization, setting up opportunities for people worldwide?
Well, our legal framework that we have in place, depending on what an organization is trying to accomplish, of course, Bermuda has an extensive financial regulatory framework going back decades. And of course, from my perspective, I'm focusing more on the data protection aspect of things, which we don't go back quite that far, but we are, I would put our law up against anybody else's because it provides the framework and the flexibility needed both to provide rights to individuals, but also to ensure that organizations develop whatever programs they need to develop to implement those rights. And we're seeing analogous laws all over the world. So I talked about the GDPR or Canadian law. We're even seeing it in California. You see it in Japan. China just passed a new privacy protection law. So every organization who wants to operate internationally is going to need to operate in this framework of principles that there's a growing consensus about. And so because of the nature of how we operate here in Bermuda, it gives you a great opportunity to work with our office, to speak with us, participate in one of our sandbox programs, if that's something that interests you. It provides those resources for whatever you're working on, whether it's a new technology or something that there's a long history of experience about how to comply with various laws. We have the resources that are available for those purposes.
Well, that is very, very helpful. Justin, you had mentioned that your business with Netki is evolving to be able to service not just, say, the individual or the company in terms of providing these data and identity verifications, but even the nation state level. And Alex just mentioned something very interesting about China, because the new privacy law in China is very, very pervasive, and it actually sets out very onerous restrictions, especially for foreign companies that are dealing with Chinese consumer data and identity data. And it must be a very interesting seat that you're in, because you have, as we just discussed, all this alphabet soup of GDPR and the EU regulations and the California privacy laws and everything that is emerging, but none of it is actually very unified. So how do you guys sort of play? Are you playing whack-a-mole, trying to manage all this? And how are you getting your business to be able to operate at the nation state level, which seems like it's going to be where we all end up eventually?
Sure. I mean, I guess there's a few different questions in there, and I'm happy to jump into them. And I guess the first is it is critically important to understand what the privacy regulations and the privacy rules are for any jurisdictions that you're processing or holding personal information really on any individuals. Most major economies and countries and many of the smaller ones now have specific regulations on what personal data can be used for, how it can be stored, who it can be shared with. In some cases, even the geography that the data can be stored in. There's countries that would prefer that their PII not be stored outside of their jurisdiction or a jurisdiction they consider to be very friendly to them. And and so that's sort of like the base requirements to anything that we do or anything that we work on. And you're right, it is an increasingly complex problem as different jurisdictions come up with their own take and their own bent on what's going on. I would say, though, that there tends to be a few kind of standard things that tend to be true across all places. And there's some things that you can do as an organization that are going to get you, most of the way protected with most jurisdictions by following some guidelines, right? So, some easy guidelines that you want to think about is you obviously, anytime that you're dealing with PII, you want to store it securely, and you want to ensure that the only people that have access to it are the people that need to have access to it for some given purpose. you want to make sure that that data isn't shared with anybody without the user's consent or without their knowledge. In many cases, if you're using the data for marketing purposes, there's a much more stringent set of regulations around what you can do with the data, how you have to manage it, what you need to notify users about, than if, for example, you use it for compliance purposes, which is the reasons that most of our users are using the data. And so, those are kinds of things that you should keep in mind anytime that you're developing the product, because not only do many of the privacy regulations have these areas in common, but it's also the best practice in using and dealing with private data is to take care of it. I'd want my data taken care of. There are some other things that come up that are specific to jurisdictions, and in some cases can be very complicated. Probably the biggest one is things called data locality regulations, where the regulator may require that the data actually be stored either inside of their jurisdiction or a friendly one. So an example of that is with GDPR, they strongly prefer that the data is stored inside of the EU. And other countries have privacy regulations that require data either be managed inside of their borders or other things. This stuff is all really very understandable because those governments are actually protecting their citizens from other companies, but also from other governments. I can imagine how China would be very concerned if all of their citizens' data was stored in a data center in the US and therefore more easily accessible to US subpoena and things like that. I think it's a very natural thing for countries to be concerned about. Well, when you're working with those countries or you're working with people inside of them, you just need to make sure that you take all of those needs into account. You understand the rules and regulations in the places that you're working with. And man, anytime that you're dealing with private customer data, and especially if there's ever a case where you're sharing it with a third party, please talk to a privacy lawyer about what you're doing and make sure that they can sign off on it and say that you're not going to get yourself in trouble.
Good advice. Good advice. Now, we've sort of run through this whole world of digital identity, but we only have a few minutes left. And so I'd love to just get a vision of the future from each of you very quickly, 30-second. What does it look like if we get this right? What does the world look like if we get this right? Lucy?
Yeah, I think speakers, especially Justin, has already mentioned like their model, right? Trying to give more power to the individuals. That's what we're trying to do, like, by kind of taking forward some of the standards that focusing on giving the data, the health data, the COVID data to individuals from like our existing database so they can make decisions, right? They can, by themselves, right? And also it takes a lot of responsibilities and off like whoever are, providing that data, right? Once the user have it, they're like, oh, I'm okay with it, then I can share with whoever I want to share with. But on the other hand, is also how we can have like the right regulations and policies in place for whoever are, processing that data, right? To make sure that, the data are not being abused afterwards, right? But I think at least like the trend is where, it's going towards, the empowering individuals, right? To have their data and to have better control of the data, know where the data, are going, how it's going to be used. And with like the legislations and policies in place to have, make sure that wherever it's used, like it's, it's properly, like Justin said, right? If you don't talk, you have to talk to a privacy lawyer because the law is very strict. So like they are concerned about if you're doing something wrong, there's some kind of punishment for businesses, right? I think that's where, we see like, going the individual empowerment.
Okay. All right. A quick word from Justin on the future. How do you see this playing out?
Sure. I mean, I think that, folks are correct that moving more towards individual empowerment is going to be important. I don't think any of us would be here if we didn't believe in the value of decentralizing information and putting more power and control into the hands of the end user. I think some other things that we're going to see is, we're going to see continued dependence on things like biometrics. Tools are going to get better around both the capture process and the analysis process of biometrics that are going to allow them to get much more deeply embedded in many of the things that we do. I think that we are going to see some shifts in the legal and compliance area over the coming years, where today, if I go through a regulatory process, I need to go through basically an individual know your customer process at every single company that I deal with. I think we're going to move more to a world of shareable credentials that create a more rugged identity, so that there is sort of point in time identity, but also more things that come along behind it. And, hopefully if we get this right, we're going to return to a world, or we're going to move to a world where much more of the information about an individual is held privately, and they're able to release that information in much more smaller and digestible chunks, where they don't need to give up everything about themselves just to share a little bit about themselves.
Great. Well, I hope our listeners and viewers have had a couple of epiphanies from this conversation. It has been truly fascinating and educational. We look forward to joining you all now in a few minutes to continue the conversation in the Continue the Conversation room in the sessions area. We'll be happy to address your questions. Thank you again for all of you taking the time to join us today, and for all of you participating from around the world in the Bermuda Tech Summit. Thanks for joining. We'll see you soon on the lovely shores of Bermuda.